Dad, stop being a meddling old man and get out of here. This dinner isn't for you. That's what I heard in front of everyone, with the steak still hot on my plate and the tortillas fresh off the griddle. There was no laughter, no hesitation, not a drop of respect in that voice. It was my own son, Ethan. He said it loud without flinching, with that look you give someone you no longer recognize. Nobody stood up. Nobody stopped him. Everyone just kept eating as if I were an old piece of furniture in the way. I stayed still. I smiled slowly. I finished my meal in silence, my heart squeezed tight like a clenched fist. My name is Ezekiel. I'm 78 years old, and I was born in a small town in the Midwest, where a man's word was still worth more than any signature. I was a baker for 43 years. I got up at 3 in the morning every single day so the neighborhood would always have fresh bread. I raised Ethan alone ever since his mother left when he was just 5. I never wanted to remarry. People said I was stubborn, but what I was loyal. He never lacked for food, school-warm clothes, or comfort. When he got sick, I'd sleep sitting in a chair by his bed. When he cried, I'd play soft music to calm his heart. And when he became a man, I sold the bakery to help him buy his first car and start his business. I gave him my life, my days and my nights, expecting nothing more than respect in return. But that night, while Ethan's friends laughed, drinking expensive tequila that I unknowingly paid for, I understood that in my own home I was an intruder. In the house I built with my own hands, that I raised with blocks, I carried myself, where I buried my dog, where the portrait of my parents hangs. They were kicking me out, not with formal words or polite requests. They were shooing me away like you'd swat a fly from the table. Just for being there, for existing, for bothering them with my presence at a dinner for young people, as one of his friends later said. They called me a meddling old man, and nobody, absolutely nobody, defended my place at that table. Not even Megan, his wife, who had cried on my shoulder so many times when Ethan lost control. That night, I said nothing. I got up calmly, took my plate to the sink, like I've done my whole life, and went upstairs to sleep. But I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed, elbows on my knees, staring at the empty wall, listening to their laughter downstairs. And I thought. I thought about every penny I put into that house, about every Sunday I didn't rest, about every time I stopped myself from buying something so Ethan could have a little more. I thought about the times he called me his hero when he was a boy, about how he used to hug me so tight. I thought, when did I become a burden? The next day I got up before everyone else, as always, but I didn't go get bread or make coffee. I went straight to the study where I keep my papers. I checked the deed to the house. Yes, it was still in my name. I never transferred it. Ethan had insisted many times, with excuses about taxes, insurance, I don't know what else. But I always refused. Not out of distrust, but out of habit, out of caution, out of respect for what it cost me. That day, that caution saved me. I went to a locksmith. I asked for all the locks to be changed, all of them. The gate, the doors, even the bathroom, if I could have. I came back in silence, like someone returning from a cemetery after burying their last hope. I waited for Ethan and Megan to leave for the supermarket like they did every Saturday morning. As soon as they were gone, I changed everything. When they returned, finding a new lock didn't amuse them one bit. Megan shouted from the yard, "Dad, what did you do? You're locking us out." And yes, I was locking them out of my house, out of the disrespect, out of my heart, because this meddling old man wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. From inside, calmly, I slid an envelope under the door. Inside was a letter, a short one. It just said, "Thank you for everything. This house is now a home again. If you need your things, let me know. I'll give you 1 week. Respectfully, Ezekiel. I didn't open the door. I didn't explain anything. I didn't want any yelling or rushed apologies. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted them to respect my silence, for them to understand the weight of a word spoken with contempt. Because it's not the same to say, "Dad, would you mind if we had a dinner party?" as it is to say, "Get out, you meddling old man." A single word can tear down years of love. And it's funny, when you're young, you think time heals everything, that it covers it all up. But when you get to my age, there's no more time to wait for people to change. Sometimes the only fair thing to do is to close the door. Now listen to me closely, son, because this story isn't just mine. It could be yours, your father's, your grandfather's. If it touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear this. Hey, tell me, what city in the world are you listening from right now, huh? Sunday morning was cloudy with that kind of gray sky that seems to signal something inside you is about to change too. I made my coffee like every other day without rushing. I sat at the table in silence, looking out at the garden. I no longer heard Ethan's footsteps rushing down the stairs, or the sound of Megan opening the cupboard looking for mugs. The house was silent. Finally. A silence that hurt, but also brought relief. Because that day, for the first time in many years, I felt like the house was mine again. Not because of the deed, not because of the walls, but because of the peace I felt just being there, without having to hide my own presence, without feeling like a burden in my own home. Mid-morning, the text message arrived. "Dad, please answer. Can we talk?" I didn't reply. I just read it and left the phone on the table. There was nothing to explain. There's no dialogue possible when respect has already gone out the window. Sometimes words are unnecessary, and silence is the only language we have left when everything has been said. This isn't about revenge. It's about dignity. Because you can forgive many things in this life, but you can't beg for affection. You can't plead for a place in the heart of someone who should offer it to you unconditionally. Over the next few days, Megan came by twice. She knocked on the door, cried, apologized. She said she didn't know Ethan was going to talk to me like that she just wanted a quiet dinner, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the truth is, she was sitting right there at the table when it happened. She said nothing. She didn't look away. She didn't defend me. Sometimes silence is also a betrayal. I told her she could come for her things on Thursday afternoon. I said she could bring someone to help her, and she did. They came with boxes, went inside, collected their belongings in silence, and left. No hugs, no tears, no goodbyes. As if they had never lived there at all. The hardest part was going into what had been Ethan's room. The desk where he studied as a child was still there, the old photos in his school uniform, the drawings he used to tape to the wall when he dreamed of being an architect. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I took a deep breath. I didn't cry. But something inside me shattered into 1,000 pieces. Not for the loss of my son, but for the loss of the man I thought he was. Because you don't mourn the person who leaves you, mourn the person who gets lost while they're still standing right next to you. After all that, I decided to do something I had been putting off for a long time. I went downtown to the notary's office. I changed my will. What I had planned to leave to Ethan, I would now designate to a foundation that helps abandoned elderly people. Old folks like me who one day gave everything for their children and ended up alone. I also reviewed my accounts, my properties, my documents. I closed off anything he could use in my name. I canceled his access. I took control of my life again. It wasn't out of anger, it was for protection, because I learned the hard way that even love needs boundaries. A neighbor, Mrs. Clara, brought me tamales that Friday. She looked at me with tenderness and said, The whole neighborhood heard Ezekiel, but let me tell you something. You did the right thing. It was about time. And those simple, honest words were like water on dry land. Because for years I had put up with disrespect disguised as jokes, hurtful comments wrapped in smiles, and that constant feeling that I was in the way in the lives of those I loved most. And no, you shouldn't get used to pain. You shouldn't accept the unacceptable just so you won't be alone. The following days I spent cleaning, organizing, putting fresh flowers on my wife's altar. I sat on the bench by the front door several times, greeting the neighbors like I used to. Some looked at me with compassion, others with respect, and I simply felt that I had recovered something I didn't know I had lost. My place in the world. Because it's not the house you defend, but the dignity that lives inside it. One day while I was watering the plants, I saw Ethan standing on the other side of the street. He didn't cross, he didn't speak. He just looked at me for a few seconds, and in his gaze I didn't see regret. I saw wounded pride, I saw frustration, maybe anger, but I didn't see love. And that's when I understood that sometimes a father's heart wants to keep believing in something that no longer exists, because it's easier to think your son loves you than to accept that you no longer matter to him. I didn't hear from him for a long time after that, and I promised myself I wouldn't seek him out. Because the people who want you seek you out. The people who respect you take care of you. And the people who love you don't kick you out of your own home to throw a dinner party for their friends. Weeks passed, entire weeks without a single message, without a call, without a word. Absolute silence. And at first, yes, it hurt. I would wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear Ethan slam the door, coming in late like he did as a teenager. I would catch myself pouring 2 cups of coffee as if I were still waiting for him to come down for breakfast with me. But no one came down. Just me. Just the sound of my spoon against the mug. Just the creak of the chair as I sat down. Habit hurts more than abandonment, because it makes you believe you still have something that's already gone. Over time, I started finding other ways to fill my days. I went back to the parish where years ago I used to help organize the community breakfasts. I started going for walks in the mornings, greeting the baker, the shoemaker, the same old faces, the ones who never left. I bought a new notebook and started writing down my memories. Not to publish them or to show anyone, but so I wouldn't forget who I am, where I come from, and everything I've lived through. Because when your soul starts to ache, you need to tell yourself your own story so you don't let others distort it. One afternoon, while I was sweeping the patio, a young neighbor, Lucy, came over with her son. "Mr. Ezekiel, would you mind if my son plays here for a little while I go run an errand?" Of course I didn't mind. The little boy, about 6 years old, started running around the plants, looking at snails, asking about everything, with that innocence only children have. And in that moment, I don't know why I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Joy. A simple, clean joy. Like when Ethan was little and would wait for me at the door with a drawing in his hand yelling, "Look, Dad, I made you a house." That boy came over many times after that, and I started to look forward to it. I taught him how to make paper boats, told him stories from when I was a baker, let him paint with my pencils. And Lucy, who at first only came out of necessity, started staying longer, bringing me sweet bread, asking me how I was doing. Little by little, without planning it, the house began to fill with voices, with footsteps, with laughter again. And they weren't my sons, but they were sincere. One night while I was eating dinner alone, I heard a familiar music coming from the street. I looked out. A group of mariachis was playing at the house across the street, and among them there was Ethan with a guitar slung over his shoulder, dressed in a black suit. I rubbed my eyes. Ethan singing, with mariachis I didn't understand. He had never shown any interest in music his whole life. But there he was, and it didn't look like an improvised performance. He looked comfortable, smiling, playing as if he'd been doing it for years. The next day, I asked a neighbor, "Oh yes, Mr. Ezekiel. Ethan's been playing with them for a few weeks now. He's doing it for money. It seems his business isn't doing so well anymore." I remained silent, not out of pity, but because of the irony of life. Sometimes you feel indispensable until life teaches you that anyone can fall. And I thought maybe now, while he sings for strangers, he'll understand what it's like to be ignored by the ones you love most. I wasn't happy about his situation. I'm not like that. But I didn't feel sorry for him either. I felt justice. Because every action has a consequence, and words thrown into the air one day they come back. There is no echo louder than that of ingratitude. And me, I was no longer willing to carry guilt that didn't belong to me. I went back to my routines. I went to the doctor. I started watching what I ate more carefully. I picked up an old hobby carpentry. In the backyard, I built a new bench. I restored a chair that Megan had broken years ago. And I even built a little birdhouse. And as I sanded, as I hammered, I felt like I was repairing myself on the inside too. Because there's no better remedy than creating something with your own hands. Especially when everything inside you has been broken before. One afternoon, Ethan approached. He didn't come in. He stayed at the gate. He called my name. Dad. I looked at him. He was gaunt. His eyes were sunken. His suit was wrinkled. I said, "What do you need?" He answered, "Nothing. I just wanted to see you." And in that moment, I understood there was still something there. A spark. But not enough to open the door to him again. I said, "I see you too. Are you done singing for those who will actually listen?" He lowered his gaze. Didn't answer. He left. And that night, for the first time, I slept in peace. Ever since that day he stood at the gate and left without saying much, I never tried to hear from him again. It wasn't out of pride. Because at my age, pride poisons more than it protects. It was because of a decision I made after many sleepless nights. I needed to live my final years in peace. And to live in peace, you have to accept that some people no longer fit in your life, even if they share your blood, even if they are your children. I started fixing up the house little by little. I changed the curtains. I painted the gate green, just like it was when Ethan's mother was still alive. I hung up some old photos that had been stored in boxes. I even opened the old wooden trunk I had hidden in the back room. Inside were letters, receipts, and even a drawing Ethan made for me as a child, with a sentence written in his own handwriting. "Dad, I love you more than the sun." I held that piece of paper for a long time, trying to remember at what point that little boy ceased to exist. Or maybe he never really existed, and was just what I wanted to see. Sometimes you create a version of your child in your heart, and you refuse to accept who the person who grew up in front of you really is. But if life taught me anything, it's that everything you endure in silence will one day overflow. And when that happens, you can no longer pretend it doesn't hurt. Because there comes a moment when opening the door to someone who disrespects you means closing it on yourself. So I decided to do something for me. Not for anyone else. For me. I went to the little downtown square where the old men usually gather to play dominoes, to tell old stories, to laugh at their own sorrows. And there, without looking for anything in particular, I began to rediscover myself. Not as Ethan's dad. Not as the old man who maintains the house. Not as the man who always gives in. Just as Ezekiel. A man who has lived, who has suffered, who has loved, and who only wants to live the rest of his days with dignity. I started gathering the savings I'd been putting away for years, penny by penny. Money I had reserved for emergencies. And well, if what I was living through wasn't an emergency of the soul, then I don't know what would be. I bought a new hammock, a big one full of colors that reminded me of my childhood. I also bought carpentry tools and a battery-powered radio. Little by little, the house started to look like me again. Less cold, less heavy with presences that used to hurt me so much. Lucy, the neighbor, started bringing her son over more often. And slowly, the boy started calling me Grandpa. Not as a joke, not out of politeness, but with real affection. Sometimes he would hug me from behind and say, "Grandpa, Grandpa, I drew you something today." And that kind of tenderness, you don't expect it, but when it arrives, it heals you in the deepest way. One afternoon, he asked me to teach him how to make bread. And there we were, the two of us in the kitchen, covered in flour, up to our eyebrows, laughing like two children, while the oven baked the first braided loaf he made himself. When it came out of the oven and he tasted it, he scrunched up his face and said, "It's a little hard, but it tastes like love." And I laughed with all my heart, like I hadn't in a long, long time. But it was on an ordinary Tuesday, a day like any other, that something unexpected knocked on my door again. 3 sharp knocks. I peeked through the window. It was Ethan. Backpack on his shoulder, a tired face, his gaze cast down. He didn't seem angry or defeated. He seemed empty. I opened the door slowly. We stood in a long silence, until he said, "I just came to give you this back." He handed me a yellowish envelope. Inside were copies of the house keys, the very keys he never apologized for trying to take ownership of. I didn't ask where he'd been or why he was back. I just said, "Thank you." He nodded. He turned to leave. But before he walked through the gate, he stopped. He took a deep breath and murmured, "I never thought you'd actually change the locks." And I replied, "I never thought you'd call me a meddling old man." He looked at me with tears welling in his eyes. He said no more. And he left. Without apologies, without lies, without anything. And I was left standing there at the door with the envelope in my hand. I didn't cry, but I felt a weight in my chest. Not for him, but for everything that could have been. And wasn't. Because what dies between a father and a son isn't love, it's hope. Now the house feels lighter, more my own. And if anyone asks if I miss him, I'll say yes, but not him. I miss the son I thought I had, the one who drew hearts on loose-leaf paper, the one who said I was his hero. But that son, maybe he only ever existed in my memories. I don't know the exact moment something breaks inside a father. Sometimes we think it's during a big fight, a hurtful shout, an obvious betrayal. But no. Most of the time it breaks in the silence, in that accumulation of small absences of words left unsaid, of cold gestures you swallow, hoping things will change. I realized it late, but I did realize it because you can close the door to your house, but the hardest thing is to close the door to your heart. More weeks went by. Ethan didn't come back. Not a call, not a letter, not even a text asking how I was. Nothing. And the funny thing is, while it hurt at first, over time, that silence also became a relief. Because there were no more broken promises, no more waiting for gestures of affection that never came. I began to look at life from a different perspective, not as someone who had been abandoned, but as someone who had chosen to stay with himself. Lucy kept bringing her son over. Sometimes they would stay for dinner. I would make chicken and rice, lentils, whatever. She loved my stews. She said they reminded her of her grandmother. And that boy saved me in more ways than he could ever imagine. He taught me that I still had love in me to give, even if my own son no longer wanted it. He taught me that true affection doesn't depend on blood, but on respect and on care. Because you can have a son and not have a family, but you can also find family where you least expect it. One afternoon, I sat in my rocking chair with the notebook on my lap, and I began to write a letter not to Ethan, but to myself. I wanted to put in writing everything I hadn't said, everything I had kept silent, everything that had hurt me. I wrote from the first day I saw him born, with his tiny trembling hands and closed eyes, to the last day I saw him walk away from the gate with the keys in his hand. I wrote about every sacrifice, every feverish night I sat by his side, every Sunday I cooked his favorite meal, every time I sold something of my own to buy him what he wanted. And I also wrote about every humiliation disguised as a joke, every gesture of indifference, every time he made me feel like I was a nuisance. When I finished, I closed the notebook, tied it with a ribbon, and put it in the closet next to the photos from my youth. It wasn't an act of resentment. It was an act of farewell, because I no longer wanted to be the man who expected something from someone who had nothing to give me. A few days later, I ran into Mr. Ramon, an old friend from the bakery I hadn't seen in years. He told me he had heard from the neighbors about what happened, and that he admired how I handled things without making a scene. We sat in the square, had a coffee from the corner cart, and he told me something that stuck with me. You can't force anyone to love you, but you can decide who you keep opening your heart to. And he was right. From that day on, I started walking differently, straighter, with more firmness. Not out of pride, but out of self-respect, because life had bent me many times. But now I was the one who decided when and to whom I would bow. One Saturday afternoon, while I was sweeping the front of the house, I saw Megan, Ethan's wife, approaching. She was alone with her hair pulled back and a tired expression. I recognized her from a distance by the way she walked with rushed steps, as if she were always in a hurry. She stopped on the sidewalk, not daring to come closer. She waved at me as if we were back in different times. I approached slowly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ezekiel," she said, looking down. I just wanted to talk to you for a moment, if you can." I didn't answer right away. I just watched her. She looked thinner, her light seemed dimmer. "Is your son okay?" I asked without emotion, just to be polite. She nodded. "More or less. He's living at a friend's house. His business went bankrupt. He can't find a steady job and, well, he doesn't say it, but I know he misses you." I said nothing. She continued. "I know what he did was terrible. I'm not here to justify it. I felt I had to come because I know he won't." "And why will you?" I asked calmly. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Because despite everything, you were always good to us. And it hurts me to see you so alone. It's not fair." I let out a soft laugh. Not of mockery, but of resignation. "Alone," I said, pointing toward the house where Lucy's son was running around with a paper airplane. "I'm not as alone as you think." She looked at the boy, and her eyes grew moist. "Can I tell you something, Mr. Ezekiel?" I nodded. "He's changed. He realizes it, but he's ashamed. He feels like he has no right to come back." "And maybe he's right," I replied without hesitation. "Because there are mistakes that aren't erased with shame, but with attitude, with actions. And sometimes when you react too late, there's no one left to ask for forgiveness." She lowered her head. She thanked me and left. That night I didn't sleep easily, not because of her or because of him, but because of me. Because sometimes you don't realize how much hope you're still holding on to until you hear yourself say out loud that that hope no longer lives here. and saying that it hurts. It hurts because it's like burying someone who is still alive, like accepting that the thing you loved so much no longer exists. The next morning, I went to the market. I bought fresh fruit, some vegetables, and 2 red roses. One I left on my wife's altar, the other I left on Lucy's doorstep, with a note that said, "Thank you for reminding me there's still tenderness in this world." That same day, the boy showed up with a new drawing. It was him, me, and a giant loaf of bread between us. Written above it was, "My grandpa is a baker of love." And in that moment, I understood everything. That child's drawing ended up hanging on my wall right above the small shelf where I keep the most important photos of my life. My wedding picture, one of Ethan, at just 3 years old, wearing a little mariachi hat, and another of me with my parents in black and white, their eyes full of hope. The picture the boy painted wasn't a perfect work of art, but it was the first portrait where I felt truly seen, understood, and loved. After so many years, not for what I gave or what I represented, but simply for being who I am. From then on, my days started to have a different rhythm. I would get up earlier with the desire to make breakfast, not just for myself, but in case Lucy or her son stopped by to say hello. I planted flowers in the small front garden, repaired the wooden fence, and even painted the steps a light blue like in the courtyards of my childhood. The house felt different no longer like a place where pain was hidden, but like a space where I had slowly begun to heal. One morning while watering the plants, I heard footsteps on the sidewalk. It was Mr. Gregory, a neighbor from down the block, with whom I had rarely exchanged more than a greeting. He asked if he could sit for a while and said, "I heard what happened with your son. It's not easy, is it?" I nodded without saying much. He continued, "Mine left 6 years ago. Said he was tired of taking care of me, that I was a burden. Haven't heard from him since. But I see you, Ezekiel, and you give me strength because you think you're the only one, but you're not." That conversation left me thinking how many fathers were going through the same thing in silence. How many were being humiliated in their own homes, ignored by those they loved most, discarded, as if they were old furniture. And the worst part, how many were still justifying that mistreatment, thinking it was just part of love because, yes. For many years, I did it too. I would tell myself that Ethan was tired, stressed, that he didn't realize what he was saying, that all children go through difficult phases. But a phase can't last a lifetime, and respect isn't a phase, it's a value. Little by little, I began to find my place in the neighborhood again. I volunteered to help at the parish with organizing the community food pantry. On Thursday afternoons, I would sit in the square with other grandfathers to read share stories and laugh at our own mistakes. There was something therapeutic in that, as if we were all reminding each other that we were still alive, that we could still serve, love, accompany, and be heard. Because the worst way to die is to feel invisible. One Friday night, while listening to music on the old radio, there was a knock on the door. 3 sharp knocks. I got up with a certain heaviness, not imagining who it could be. When I opened it, I found Ethan alone without a backpack, expressionless, with swollen eyes, messy hair, and a broken voice. "Dad," he barely said. "I'm not here to ask for anything, I just want to give you this." He held out a letter, handwritten. I didn't open it right then. I looked him in the eye. There was something different in them, but there was also an abyss, as if he had gotten lost within himself and didn't know how to come back. I didn't tell him to come in. I didn't hug him. I didn't reject him. I just nodded. He lowered his gaze, turned, and left. He disappeared, walking slowly down the empty street. I closed the door gently, leaned my back against the wood, and sat down with the letter in my hands. I read it that same night. It was short. It said, "Dad, I know I messed up. I know I wasn't enough. I can't change what I said or what I did, but I want you to know that I know. It hurts. It hurts that I lost your trust, your love, your home. Sometimes I feel like I lost my soul, too. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry for everything. Ethan." I finished reading. I folded the letter. I put it in the drawer where I also kept the copy of the keys he had returned to me months ago. I didn't cry, but I didn't feel relief either, because sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive like a peaceful breeze, but like a half-open door that you're still not brave enough to walk through. The following days passed quietly. I didn't answer the letter. I didn't look for him. I didn't mention it because there was something inside me that still needed time. Time to distinguish if this attempt at redemption was coming from pain or from love, because they are different things. And I was no longer willing to receive only the scraps of regret. One Sunday, while I was making bread at home, Lucy arrived with her son. The boy was carrying a small box wrapped in red paper. He handed it to me smiling and said, "It's for you, Grandpa." I opened it. It was a small wooden figure, a little bread roll carved with a child's pocket knife. On the back, there was an inscription: "The bread you make feeds more than the stomach." I was speechless. It was a simple gift, but to me it was worth more than any inheritance, because it reminded me that my value didn't depend on what I had lost, but on what I was still capable of offering. That night, I slept deeply. For the first time in a long time, I felt that everything that had happened had brought me to this point where the pain no longer ruled, where the silence was no longer heavy, where the love I gave and the love I could still give were in balance. The next day, I sat on the porch with my cup of coffee and watched the sunrise. I thought about Ethan. I thought about what was, what wasn't, and what would never be again. And inside me, for the first time, there was no anger, only acceptance, because you can love someone deeply and still make the decision to protect yourself. I don't know if he will ever come back. I don't know if he will ever truly understand. But what I do know is that I'm no longer waiting for him, and that for me is already freedom. Freedom, when it arrives, doesn't make a sound. It doesn't come in through the front door or appear suddenly like in the movies. It slips in silently, settles into the small gestures, in the way you pour your coffee without rushing in, breathing deeply, without fear of what comes next. And that's what I began to feel, not because the wound had completely closed, but because it was no longer bleeding. Because I had stopped asking myself where I went wrong and started looking at myself with more tenderness, with more truth. I was no longer the hurt father or the disillusioned man. I was me, Ezekiel, an old man who still knew how to look at the sky and be thankful to be alive. The days were calm. I would get up early as always and go out to sweep the front of the house. I'd greet the neighbors, tend to my plants, and when Lucy and her son came to visit, the day took on a different color. The boy had become part of my routine. He would hug me with that strength only children who feel safe have. He would ask me questions about everything, about the bread, about the sky, about the stray dogs, and I would answer as if I were rediscovering the world with him. There were moments when I forgot the past, or rather I didn't forget it, but it no longer hurt me like it used to. One market day, I ran into Mrs. Beatrice, a woman who had been a friend of my late wife. We started talking, and she invited me to a small group for seniors that met on Tuesday afternoons at the Cultural Center. I went out of curiosity, and what I found there surprised me. People like me with hard stories, with losses on their shoulders, but with a desire to laugh, to learn, to share. Some painted, others sang, others simply listened. I felt good, I felt accompanied, I felt useful. I started attending every week. I would bring homemade bread to share, and in return, I received stories, songs, hugs. I started playing the guitar again after many years. My fingers were clumsy, but my soul loosened up when the first chords rang out. Life suddenly was no longer just a memory. It was the present, it was possibility. But calm never lasts forever. One afternoon on my way back from the cultural center, I found a note under my door. It was from Ethan. It said, "Dad, I just want to know if you're okay. I know I have no right, but I think about you every day." I didn't know what to feel when I read it. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was something harder to explain. It was as if the wound reopened, but not to bleed, but to air out. I sat in my rocking chair with the note in my hand, and just stayed there in silence, letting the emotions do whatever they had to do. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of anxiety, but because something was stirring inside me. I didn't know if it was compassion or renewed disappointment. I thought about answering him. I thought about ignoring him. I thought about everything I had already thought so many times, but in the end, I did nothing. I just breathed because sometimes the true act of healing isn't talking, but letting the silence speak for you. A few days passed without anything new. The routine returned to its serene rhythm. The boy brought me another drawing, this time of a house with a huge garden, and the phrase, "Kindness lives here." I hung it up next to the other one. They were my new trophies, not of victory, but of resilience. One afternoon, while I was watering the plants, Lucy asked if she could speak with me alone. She looked uncomfortable. She sat on the stone bench in the patio and said, "Mr. Ezekiel, I don't want to meddle, but Ethan reached out to me. He called me a few days ago. He asked me to tell him about you. He told me to tell him how you are, what you're doing, if you still reject him." "And what did you tell him?" I asked without changing my tone. "The truth," she replied. "I told him I see you calmer, more whole, that you've started smiling again. But I also told him that you're not the same, that you no longer expect anything from him." I nodded. There was nothing more to say. She looked me in the eye and said, "Ethan doesn't know how to fix what he broke. And honestly, neither do I." "He doesn't have to fix it," I replied, "because there are things that when they break, don't get fixed. They transform. And you have to decide if you want to live with the broken pieces or if you want to start something new." Lucy remained quiet. Then she hugged me. And in that gesture, I understood that I had been heard not by Ethan, but by her. And that was healing too. Days later at dusk, someone rang the doorbell. I opened it to find a cardboard box. There was no one in sight. Inside the box was a photo album. It was my old album, the one I thought I had lost. It was full of pictures of Ethan as a child, of me holding him, of our old house under construction, of his first birthday, his graduation. On the cover, a piece of paper said, "Thank you for being everything, even though I didn't know how to value it." I took the album to the living room, put it on the table, and opened it. I looked at each photo as if it were the first time. I smiled. I cried a little. I remembered, but not with pain, with respect, with gratitude for having lived it, even if it didn't end the way I wanted. That same day, I decided to do something. I went to the closet. I took out the notebook where I had written my inner letter, the one I never delivered, and I burned it in the yard. Not as an act of rage, but as an act of closure. The fire consumed it slowly, and with each burning page, I felt something inside me being released. There was no forgiveness, no reconciliation, but there was peace. And peace was enough. The night fell slowly. I sat on the porch bench with Lucy's son, who was playing with a spinning top. I stroked his hair, and he said to me, "Grandpa, when I grow up, I want to be like you." I smiled at him, my eyes moist, and replied, "Then you are already better than me because you know how to love without hurting." In that moment, I knew that even though my son had failed me, I had not failed as a father because I still had love to give. And that love now had another destination, one that didn't hurt, one that brought me back to life. There are moments that aren't announced, they don't arrive with music or letters, they don't have a name or a time. They just happen like a gust of wind that changes direction. That's how it was that day, an ordinary morning with the sun streaming through the window and the smell of freshly baked bread filling the house. I was in the kitchen, my hands covered in flour, when I heard someone stop in front of the gate. They didn't knock, they didn't speak, just a shadow still. I looked through the curtain and knew immediately. It was Ethan. He was wearing an old jacket, his face was thinner, his gaze fixed on the ground. He just stood there like someone who no longer expects anything, but also has nowhere else to go. I didn't move. I watched him in silence, my heart calm. There was no anger, no fear, no hope, just the certainty that this young man was no longer the boy I had raised, and that I was no longer the father who expected hugs as a reward. I didn't open the door for him. I went back to my dough, to the bowl, to the oven, but that image remained etched in my mind for the rest of the day. And that night, sitting in my rocking chair, I thought, how many more times will he come? How many more times will they try to stand in front of my door, not knowing if they will be welcomed? And how many more times will I just sit here unable to decide whether to let in the thing that once broke me in two? The next day, I went to the cultural center as usual. There, among board games and muted laughter, I felt a little less old, a little more human. Mr. Jamie, one of the gentlemen I shared domino afternoons with, told me something that resonated with me. "Ezekiel, sometimes you don't have to choose between forgiving or